Okay, so there's two things what I'd like to do in this paper. First of all is I'd like to give you what's being defined as the common sense view of integration, and then I'd like to present an alternative understanding of what we understand as integration within the context of political theory. So that's basically what I have in store today. So let me just start off with what's known as the common sense view. And here, basically what I'm doing is giving a nod towards the Italian Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci in his Prison Note Diaries. And here he basically talks about the idea of the common sense, i.e. Views of the world which we can internalize, not necessarily analytically, but views of the world that we can internalize uncritically. So let me just start off with a quotation. This quotation is taken from a book, a kind of standard book really, that you will find this particular rhetoric going through a number of understandings of Muslims and integration. So let me just start off with a quotation. So he argues that the failure to fully integrate Muslims within societies of France, Germany, and United Kingdom has the potential to foster social and political instability in these states over both long-term and short-term. And I think what you've got there is perhaps a summary of most of the political rhetoric that comes out both within media, government, and also policy discourses about a certain understanding of integration and managing the flow of immigrants, etc. Now, I've got two observations to make in this respect. So first is, perhaps there's a disconnect between the articulation of policy and the lived reality that's actually on the ground. So let me give you two examples that reinforce this point. So my first example is obviously survey data. So if you turn to Congress poll back in February 2015, it found that 95% of Muslims feel loyal to Britain and 93% say that they should obey British law. So that's perhaps one evidence. And if you feel that this is an isolated incident, we can also look at the think tank Demos, who also did a similar survey back in 2009, and they basically highlighted about 83% of Muslims are proud to be British citizens. And once again, if you feel that that's also an isolated poll, we can also look at the Gallup poll back in 2009, in which they found that 77% of Muslims identified with Britain, compared to 50% of a population, of the general population. And I can go on and on and on with these hard data, these statistics. Now, also, if we turn to, say, for example, theological discussions, one would have envisaged that Muslims in Britain actually demonstrate a kind of a conservative interpretation of their theology. But once again, if we look at the academic debate that's actually taking place, that's not necessarily the case. So if we look at gender equality, I mean, the writings of Keisha Ali and various other people come to mind. Even if you look at the notion of liberal citizenship, whether or not Muslims and liberal citizenship is an innate contradiction. One thinks of Andrew Marsh's seminal work on this, or even let's take the question of salvation, soteriology. If you look at the works of Hassan Khalil, you will find that there's a huge, perhaps an open kind of discussion on the question of salvation within theology. And here I must confess that I'm not a theologian, but I just find that this piece of literature to be quite interesting in the sense that Muslims are finding themselves or redefining their social reality in light of theological discourses. Now, I could have actually kind of gone with this understanding, or this analysis, if you like, to demonstrate the disconnect between public rhetoric on the one hand and the lived reality on the other. I really don't want to do that. What I want to do instead is to offer a different way of understanding, a different way of assessing the concept of integration. And I want to do this basically by drawing upon, say, for example, the likes of Edward Said, the late Palestinian intellectual, and in which, I mean, he wrote volumes. And one of the books that's not necessarily cited is his BBC Youth Lectures, titled The Representation of the Intellectual. And here he offers an interesting way of understanding the intellectual. He doesn't necessarily see it through the French perspective, but rather he sees the role of the intellectual, i.e. anyone. It can be an artist, it can be a teacher, it can be a journalist, it can be a university lecturer, etc. And he basically says the role and the job of the intellectual is to engage skeptically. Yeah? So, for example, if there's a received wisdom that's actually been presented, the job of the intellectual is to question that. Yeah? He also basically talks about the idea of a radical investigation. So, for example, if there's a viewpoint that's been presented, the role of the intellectual is not necessarily to internalize that, but rather to question it. And also, following on that kind of intellectual heritage, if you like, if you look at one of my favorite sociologists is a Jewish intellectual by the name of Zygmunt Bauman, not because he lives in Leeds, which is just a close proximity to where I live, but I mean, he kind of offers a number of insights, and perhaps one of the best books, I think, on the question of Jews and the question of integration is summarised in his book by Modernity and Ambivalence. Fantastic book. Really, really amazing book. That I think also Muslims can actually take a number of lessons from by understanding the Jewish question back in the 18th and the 19th century. And one of the interviews, Bauman basically says, is that once again, the role of the academic is to cast a suspicious eye on any claim that the social world operates in an orderly way and with a tendency towards equilibrium. Yeah, so this idea that, the world that we live in is a very straightforward world. But in reality, people's lives and the political context is very complex and sophisticated. And basically what he's arguing is that in order for us to make sense of that, you need to be suspicious. Yeah, you have to be skeptical. So here we've got, I've just kind of laid out my views in relation to that. But I can also cite the great a sociologist and historian of the 14th century. I did my doctoral thesis into his works, the great Ibn Khaldun. And he basically looks at how we basically do history. And I think for him, back in the 14th century, he changed the way people did history by looking at systematically analysing evidence. What is the evidence for this? And I've tried to incorporate this particular methodology in my work, with the issues of sexual grooming in the northern mill towns areas, but also looking at this big debate around the Trojan Horse, kind of a controversy. So, once if you start off with a skeptical lens, you go through the evidence and the data, and lo and behold, you kind of have a different understanding, different perspective of the world. Okay, so that's just give you an overarching context really of where I'm coming from. You still awake? Okay. So what I'd like to do now is to problematize the concept of integration. I'm going to do this by offering three observations, three ways in which the category of integration can be problematized. Firstly, I'd like to look at the history, how the concept of integration has kind of evolved. Secondly, I'm going to do a conceptual analysis. What exactly do we mean by the concept of integration? And finally, I want to kind of problematize it in a sociological context. What exactly does it mean socially? So let's take up the first debate about history. And here, I mean, if for those people who know the writings of Edward Said, you'll know that he uses the French philosopher Michel Foucault a lot. And in fact, he kind of applies Michel Foucault's ideas to his work. And what Foucault was basically the argument is, in order for you to make sense of reality, you have to understand it historically. So, for example, our previous lecturer did an excellent presentation on happiness and mental health. And Foucault's written some fantastic works on this, the evolution of mental health and how that kind of evolves, conceptually speaking. So let's basically look at how historically the concept of integration has been used. And I think once again, with the Muslim experience, I think we can draw heavily upon the Irish experience, but also the Jewish experience as well. And here basically what we find is that integration isn't a process that minority communities go through. You know, i.e. the famous Chicago school model, whereby migrants come into the whole society, gradually go through a process of evolution, and they become integrated or assimilated. I don't necessarily represent that worldview. Because what you find is that the way in which integration as a category is used throughout history, it's used as a device to create a sense of otherness, or a misrepresentation of the other as the pariah. Yeah. So, for example, within the context of the Irish experience, the question of loyalty was actually asked there, and who are you loyal to? Are you loyal to Vatican City, or are you loyal to the nation state? Britain, yeah, king country, etc. So I think there's something there about the question of loyalty and how it's kind of evolved over the years as well. But let's take some time and look at the Jewish experience. And I'm doing this by looking through the works of Zygmunt Bauman once again. And for him, he basically finds that the Jews within pre-war Germany, the idea of assimilation for Jewish people was contradictory. It created a sense of isolation, and it also reinforces a sense of ambivalence. Even with assimilation, Bauman argues that the Jewish people were identified as having a problematic presence. And here, if we quote something from his classical text, Modernity and Ambivalence, he says that the assimilating Jews acted under a pressure to prove their Germanhood, yet the very attempt to prove it was held against them as evidence of their duplicity and in all probability also of subversive intention. End of quote. So this idea that even when you have full assimilation taking place, or even when you have full integration taking place, the debate doesn't necessarily shift. The debate still uses it as a way of problematizing the outsiders. So that's the point that basically Bauman is trying to make. And I mean, I've done some traveling through Bosnia and Herzegovina, mainly because my journey to my Muslim identity actually came through the Bosnian War back in the 1990s. And once again, when you travel that land, when you speak to people, or when you read the historical the historical evidence, I mean, Muslims in Bosnia was fully assimilated, but yet still, you know, when it came to the genocide, they were still marked by a racialized presence about us and them. So I think once again, if you look at history, we can basically make sense of how the concept of integration has kind of used, if you like. So that's some historical observation. Let me quickly go to the conceptual understanding. And here, once again, if you just give a quick footnote about history. I mean, I've talked about the Irish experience and the Jewish experience. I mean, the black experience is also really, really important for us as Muslims, but also as general people trying to make sense of what we mean by integration. And I think if you look at the works of Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, I came to him quite later on in my academic life, and I think to really understand how one makes a journey from advocating assimilation to advocating integration and then maintaining this idea of separateness is really exemplified in his writing, and also the reasons why he makes those political journeys. I think there's some really interesting ways in which we can use his experience as a way of understanding our contemporary reality. Okay, so let's quickly look at concept. Been rattling on for 15 minutes. If you beg your patience for another 10 more minutes, I'll have it done. Okay, so let's move to look at how it's understood conceptually. Now, we can have a starting point. I mean, we can look at the category of integration, how it's evolved throughout the period, from the 1960s onwards. Yeah. Initially, it was used as a way of indicating assimilation. Then it was used as a way of indicating kind of multiculturalism. Later on, it was used as a way of understanding the notions of liberalism. So the category evolves as well. So our understanding of integration evolves from one particular moment of history to another. But also, if you look at it within the context of Europe and France in particular, when they talk about integration, they have a particular understanding of integration through the lens of laicité, so the idea of secularism. So here, once again, there is no universal agreement as to what integration perhaps means. So the quotation that I started off with, the failure to fully integrate Muslims within France, Germany, United Kingdom, integration would mean different things in those particular countries, but also it will mean different, will have different connotations within a small span of history within that period as well. So now I think when people talk about integration, especially our Tory government, they have the idea of muscular liberalism in mind. I mean, one can only refer back to Cameron's speech in Munich, whereby he kind of articulated a certain understanding of integration, and he used the term muscular liberalism. And I really don't want to get into how the concept of muscular liberalism has been evolved over the years, but suffices to say that liberalism has a certain take on the good life. Yeah? So going back to the previous talk, I mean, understanding of the good life, and they would basically say understanding of the good life is to live a liberal life based upon individualism, etc. So it has a certain a connotation. It has a certain connotation. The concept of integration. But I mean, for me, I think liberalism is very complicated. And one thing that people don't realize is that if you look at how liberalism evolved over a period of time, it's got some really dark history associated with it. I mean, we can look at the works of John Locke, we can look at the works of John Stuart Mills and their views on slavery. So when they talked about liberalism, they had liberalism for a particular group and class of people. And sadly, even women were excluded, black people were excluded from that category of liberalism and liberal values, etc. So I think there is a lack of understanding, a lack of appreciation of how these terminologies perhaps mean, and what these terminologies, the significance of these terminologies. So let me just leave you with, if you're really interested in this area of understanding liberalism or muscular liberalism, if you read a really good, I think it's an Italian translation, published by Verso, by Domenico Lasordo. His book, if I'm not mistaken, it's Liberalism, a Counter History. So I think what we've got here, I think it's when we use these terminologies, if we basically apply scrutiny, we have a completely different understanding of what these mean. But that's not to say, I mean, I did a similar presentation at the British Sociological Association conference a couple of weeks ago from Glasgow, and someone had a degree of my take on liberalism, and he was basically saying, quite rightly so as well. So let me just do justice to that. I mean there is also an alternative way in which liberalism, unfortunately, it's not necessarily kind of fashionable now, but it gave birth to multiculturalism, gave birth to kind of cosmopolitanism. So there is also a different history of liberalism, but unfortunately, in my humble opinion, that worldview is not the dominant worldview at this moment of time. Okay, so that's the concept of integration done. Let me just come to my final point here. If I beg your patience for another 4 more minutes, I'll have it all wrapped up. Socially speaking, one has to say that a lot of people in the West don't want Muslims to integrate. So the idea that we are having that Muslims should integrate, or the Romanians should integrate, or the Irish should integrate, there is also a huge body of evidence that basically demonstrate that people don't want these racial outsiders to integrate. Why? Because of 2 reasons. Number one is because of this idea of racial naturalism. So naturally, fundamentally, they are inherently different to us. And this also kind of plays out in many different ways. Both, you look at the policy debates, but also within media debates as well. I mean, take this recent election. I mean, I've not been following it very closely, but it seems to me that there is a subtext that all these brownies have come over and kind of ruin the way in which we do politics, or by having an idea of fair play within the cricket, by all these brownies have kind of ruptured this idea of fair play in cricket. But there is a subtext there that basically argues that people are racial outsiders, somehow are racially different. Yeah, so this idea of racial naturalism. Historically used to have biological connotations, but now I think it actually has a lot of cultural undertones to it. So in the past it was, these people were biologically inferior, but now this idea that these people are culturally inferior. So there is a substitution with biology, with culture. Also, there is this idea of what Palgrave talks about, this idea of racial historicism. So in the first way that these people are perhaps different culturally, they are also different historically, because they don't necessarily follow that Plato to NATO sequence of history. That these people don't necessarily have any history. Yeah? So these people are kind of don't necessarily embody a sense of progress. So once again, there is a various subtext to the way in which we debate and conceptualize these understandings. So I think it's really important for us to realize that these things happen, not necessarily at a conscious level, but also like on a subconscious level as well. So I think socially, the integration discourse is also problematic because it doesn't necessarily factor those issues. Yeah, you don't necessarily filter those debates and discussion through those lenses. But also, a couple of observations just to finish with, is that the integration debate has a sense of binary to it. So in other words, that integration is good, segregation is bad. Yeah? So this idea of racialized binary that's taking place. And also this racialized binary has a Manichaean flavor to it as well. This good and evil type of issue. But I mean, my research has basically found that you can actually have integration through segregation. In fact, so my field work, some of the really interesting field note that I basically made was speaking to a group of Muslim female students in a secondary school. It's a Muslim faith school. And I had kind of ambivalence of going into these group of young girls because I really didn't know what type of issues that we're going to be exploring. But anyway, as the interview kind of started, it was very clear that these girls, although they attended a segregated school. In many respects, they were fully integrated in terms of their literature, in terms of their conversation, in terms of their understanding of Britishness and change in society. And in fact, their segregated presence allowed them to have a dialectical relationship with the concept of integration as well. So I think there is something there also about how, how we talk about segregation equals something which is inherently bad. Once again, if you look at the evidence, it doesn't necessarily sustain that. So that's all I have for you. So in conclusion, what I've tried to do is to give you a problematic understanding of integration, hopefully through society, through history, but also trying to raise the question of what does integration mean within the context of a globalized society? What does the concept of integration mean within the experience of diaspora? I had a teenage boy at home, and I said to him, I'm making this journey from Manchester to London. Can you save me some of your favourite music on the iPod? And I did it just as a way of understanding his journey as well. And I was pleased to know that he'd take all hip-hop, 90s classics, but also recent artists like Immortal Technique. So you've got a 14, 15-year-old kid who's also trying to make his sense of his own reality, not necessarily through the roots of South Asia or Islam, but through Latin America and the black experience within that context as well. So, our journeys, are different. So what does integration mean within that sphere? So on that note, I'll end. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that talk. We have a bit more time this time, a half an hour, I think you're saying. But if you can keep it as brief as possible so more people can talk first person, second person, third, which is a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we can be here all night talking about it, but beyond that.
Thank you for the talk. Ed was saying something very profound in his last book, and before he died, and his experience as a Palestinian Christian made him an outsider every time. So the integration question came throughout his life. But at the end of his life, he said that his experience of being an outsider was his strength. And I think that also applies to British Bangladeshis, that we've done our best, we've done lots of work to be integrated, but there comes a time when the whole society needs to integrate you more. And if you don't, you make a statement like Ed was saying. He's tried, he's rejected, and he's now established his own identity. And I think we can draw inspiration from that.
Thank you.
Just two questions for you. Firstly, are there any self-imposed barriers to integration into liberalism? And secondly, although I accept, although I said that, but I do accept that there are racism and there are all those barriers there, but sometimes you can have some kind of self-imposed barriers as well. And then one second question is, are some ethnicities more accepted to certain societies than others? Although we can presume to be all brownies, but obviously it's not a homogeneous brownie community. We have all, a various diaspora of like a segregated way of understanding and living and culture. So, if you can answer this question.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So your first question about self-imposed, you can have two things. You can either self-consciously impose something on yourself, or you can actually do it without having a consciousness. So So I think there's two things. So,
Well, the kind of references like some sort of way of living, like religious barriers. For example, I choose not to participate in certain mainstream cultures because of my religious beliefs or my own self-beliefs.
Okay, all right. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so here my take on this. My understanding of culture is that it's not fixed. So when people say, well, I want to actually maintain a pristine understanding of Muslim culture, that is, I would argue, it's a sense of false consciousness, because what's happening there is that culture inevitably changes. Culture inevitably always goes through a state of flux. Almost right then. Okay, so the culture always goes in a state of flux. So it's not fixed. So I'll give you a classical example. If you look at Muhammad Qasim Zaman, he's the expert on Muslim seminaries. He writes from the US, and he basically, most of his studies that they've done on the Indian seminary called the Deobandi School. And he basically demonstrates in his book of how one imagines as an outsider looking in that their understanding of culture has been a frozen in time. But in itself, he demonstrates through debates and through theological kind of exchanges that also goes through a certain change. So the way in which the Deobandi school of thought works in India is different to Pakistan, is different to United States, is different to Britain. So what we try to, our understanding of culture, I guess, it's more complicated than we give attention to. I hope that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm interested in your views on, in the context of integration of the Bangladeshi community into British society. I wonder what your views are, firstly, on the fact that the Bengali people were colonized, whereas, say, the Romanian people currently in Britain were not. I'm speaking as an Irish woman, and a lot of parallels between Ireland and India, as you'll probably be aware. And the other thing is the fact that Britain twice forced partition on Bengal, first 1905 and then 1947, when 1905 one didn't work out to their satisfaction. And I just wonder whether you feel that the fact that they did ultimately succeed in dividing and ruling in 1947, does this have any impact in your view on the Bangladeshi psyche, being colonized and B, twice being wrongly parted from the West Bengalis?
Thank you, very interesting question.
Okay, I'm a bit of a fake now. I'm not a historian, so I'm sorry I can't actually respond to the historical context of your question, but what I can say is to make two observations how what it means to be a Bangladeshi in the context of Britain. So the title of my paper had the concept of diaspora, and there's two ways in which I think you can understand diaspora. One is the classical model, whereby this idea of unioning back to a homeland. And once again, this notion that culture doesn't necessarily change, that we will go back to this kind of a landscape which is beautiful, a landscape which has certain kind of connotations to it as well, whether it be poetically, whether it be sense of literature, etc. So that's the one model of diaspora, and obviously the Jewish experience of the Aliyah to go back to Israel, that's basically follows that kind of historical route, and also the black experience as well. If you read Du Bois, Malcolm X, and various other writers, they also talk about this idea of going back to Africa. So I mean, that's one model. The other model, which I perhaps allude to, and this is why my reading of Edward Said is pretty important, because I think the sense of diaspora, the sense of exile, gives an individual a sense of creative presence, and the creativity helps us to kind of survive in any environments. I mean, I like to visit Turkey on a regular basis, and I feel at home in Turkey. I mean, I've travelled all throughout China. I feel at home in China, and the reason why I think I feel home in any geographical locations is because of my sense of the diaspora. The fact that I was born in Oldham, the fact that my father's, migrated from Sylhet. So I think it does give an individual a sense of kind of creativity, and you can demonstrate that through kind of music, through art, through culture, etc.
Thank you. You want to come here?
Yeah, very, very short. It's about the difference between UK and France. You mentioned France. Which do you think is better for integration? I mean, just for getting along together better. The French way, where everything's secular, including Christians can't wear things as well as Muslims can't wear things, or our British one with all this interfaith, discussing religion all the time, the one compulsory item on the curriculum, which is better?
Thank you.
The British.
But that's because you live here.
Yeah. Don't celebrate.
Well, I would, but other people might not be.
Okay, let me do justice to the question. I don't have a lot of time for the French model, and if you look at, this idea of secularism. I mean, if you look at recent statistics of French people, and I think it was a questionnaire survey that was asked about how the percentage of the French population who are religious. I think somewhere in the regions of, I can give you the exact source, but source coming to my mind, it's about 65% of the French population said that they had a faith or believed in a faith, whether it be Christianity, etc. And it didn't factor in the Muslim experience there. So I think with France, I think they have a deep problem with Muslims. Historically as well, if you look at the Algerian War of Independence, etc. So I think the French case is really, I'm really skeptical of anything that comes out of France. But it's not just me. This model of laicity, there's a number of French academics who are challenging this model as well, and different versions of secular liberalism. So if you look at Laborda's book, the title of the book is Critical Republicanism, The Critical Republic. That's a really fascinating book, and I think that might help answer the question. In the context of Britain, obviously, liberalism has taken historically, as I pointed out, historically it took a different turn. In the 1980s, I remember 88, this one report did try and introduce the idea of educational multiculturalism. You have the Grooming Trust written a number of reports. We've got Tariq Madood over at Bristol, we've got Biko Parek. Our understanding of cultural tolerance, if you like, has a much richer take than against the French. And I guess it would do, wouldn't it? Because French's history is completely different. We don't need to go into the history of France and their relationship with religion and state religion.
Thank you. Anybody else? There's no hands up at the moment. Any questions?
I don't think our religion religious education is divisive?
Religion?
Sorry, no.
Yeah, is religious education divisive?
Well, because of our separate schools is what I mean.
Oh, okay. I think British society is by definition divisive, based on class. So if you look at no, I know, but I mean, if you look at Daniel Doring, he says, well, why is it that we've got such a big fixation with religion and segregation on the grounds of religion, when we don't have a big issue with segregation to do with class? I mean, that's another factor of the equation that people don't want to talk about. I mean, I'm a senior lecturer at university, but if you ask me, I'm through and through working class. What I eat, how I socialise, books that I read, etc. And so I mean, and class is really important. I think class is really important. And the vast majority of the Muslims that attend faith schools have to pay. So there's also a class dynamic there as well.
Good, very good point. I agree with that.
I have two questions. One really is from this morning. How do you think what's happened in Tower Hamlets recently, very, very recently, might affect our younger population, our younger Muslim Bengali population? Because I think we need to be aware that they may very well be angry, and what is anyone doing about it? I live on an estate where all my neighbours are Bengali, and you probably know from my accent, I'm one of those racial outsiders. I'm Irish. And the other aspect of what I'd like to say is I'd hate to see the Bengali community lose their Bengaliness, because I think it's really important. And a few years ago we had some American students come by our estate. They spoke Sylheti perfectly, fluently, and some of the young boys, 15, 16, were saying to me, they speak our language better than we do. And I thought, why are we letting this happen? It's not about being separate, it's not about being assimilated, it's about cherishing that which makes you unique, and that's essential to the whole cake. Because if you took all the raisins and everything else out, it would be very bland. So I have two questions.
Very good question.
The first one, easy cop out for me. I don't live in Tower Hamlets, so no, but nevertheless, I will give my observation. To what extent are young people involved in politics generally? Whether it be, Bengali with, that's a broad question. Is it high? Okay, I stand corrected, it's quite high. But I listen to the radio flow every morning, but recently I just had to turn it off. Because it's just how politics is presented. I find it to be quite a tad boring, so even if young people won't necessarily engage with politics, conventional politics, party politics, I don't know. I'd really like more young people to actually take an active role, an active part in politics. I don't know if that answers your question. Second question, was it something to do with Bangladeshis?
Retaining their cultural language.
Uniqueness, yeah, I think it's great. But it has to come with the proviso that our understanding of what Bangladeshiness is also changes from one particular moment to another. So as long as it's inclusive and recognises the fact that there is a flux that culture actually goes through, it is good. In the same way, I mentioned this to my students. If you're Catholic, be a good Catholic. If you're a Marxist, be a good Marxist. I think diversity is good. It'd be rather boring if everybody was like UK. It'd be a boring world.
Thank you. Anybody else? Do you want to come forward? Unless you've got a really super loud voice and everybody can hear you.
21st.
Who?
Me first. 21st.
Yep.
Yeah, I have a question. So, sharing my Bible.
We've got about 10 minutes.
Well, thank you for your lecture. It was quite insightful. Also, it's not a subject that I know a lot about. It's just what I read in the papers, and, every now and then. Going back to what you mentioned about Bosnia and your travels around there, I also recall you said you're not a historian, but you might have a first-hand account of stories of that area where the community there were very much integrated, the Muslims and non-Muslims, but yet there was a crisis in the 90s where the division was based around religion and Christianity. So my main question is about integration and assimilation. I'm a Bengali. I feel I am integrated, but I have my own identity. I mean, at work, a lot of people go to pubs. I don't go to pubs because I don't drink. I don't see the point. So how do you decide when the community has integrated with the wider society or assimilated? Is there a criteria? You also mentioned the UKIP. Obviously, they have various things they talk about. If you do certain things, you're integrated. Can you elaborate on, if there is such a criteria, and how you know you've actually integrated, assimilated?
Very good question. I'm still confused about that.
That's an easy question, thank you. As a sociologist, I can say for certainty there is no universally agreed definition of integration. So I hope that answers your second part of your question. The first part of the question, let me answer it in a different way. There's a friend of mine who's written a really interesting book called Arun Kundranani. He was at the Institute of Race Relations for many years. He's over in the States. It's the title of the book called The Muslims Are Coming. And he has this really fantastic observation in one of the chapters. He basically talks about Arabs in United States, fully assimilated. In fact, on the census, when they ask the census question, they always tick the white box. Yeah? So, for all sense of purposes, they were fully integrated or fully assimilated. And then 9/11 happened. And then they woke up and they realized that they were Muslims. So the question is to do with acceptance. I can say whoever I am. I can be a Marxist, I can define myself in the way in which I want to be or want to do. But it's the question of acceptance, whether or not you're willing to accept me. I can say that. I love Turkey. I go there every year. Love their history, love their people, love their food. If I was to turn around and say I'm Turkish, it's not going to wash. It's to do with acceptance as well. So I think that's also another way of. There's another important dimension as well.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, and interesting. I could have done this one there. Interesting speech. I'm going to ask a political question and then a general observation. So, what do we say to our Bengali community, not just in Tower Hamlets, but across England, who have found a synergy in UKIP's rhetoric? Simply the one of too many people, not enough resources, so we can't let any more people in. That one. And then my second observation is, when I go around the world and I look at the concept of assimilation, what seems to be often missing is the New Zealand experience. From the outset, and the history, as I read it, is we will be two people. And we will coexist, but we will be two people. And that mantra and that identity stays today. And as a consequence, when I'm reading New Zealand history and politics, people are actually voting in their politics according to class, as opposed to according to the other dynamics that I just mentioned, motivating some people in UKIP, for example. Thank you.
Thanks.
Wow, that's just a fantastic question. Can I ask your name, please?
Oh, excuse me. I should also say I'm Tina Lashmore. I'm also standing as a candidate over here.
But that's not the reason for the question.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's a really, I mean, I like the first part of your question. And I say this to my students, I mean, I get invited to a lot of places to speak. I mean, one thing that I think we, as Muslims, fail to do is to realize that our history reflects the history of other people that have come here as well. So, for example, we can learn a great deal from the Irish experience, from the Jewish experience, as I've said, from the black experience, but also understanding how racialized outsiders were constructed in the past, and also how they get constructed in the future as well. You'll be mistaken. I mean, I love to run. That's how I kind of unwind. Recently, I went to my local corner shop after a job. I was sweating, obviously, and just to buy the Guardian, just to give you a hint of my politics. And the conversation by the Asian shopkeeper with the person that's just come to drop loaves of bread was really, really fascinating. The Asian shopkeeper was saying, "Oh, look at all these Romanians, they've come and taken all of our jobs." And the chap that was dropping off the bread, he was saying, "Yes, it's really awful, isn't it? But they're not like you, the Pakistanis, because the Pakistanis are fully integrated." And I think to say, really? I mean, we have historical amnesia. And it's sadly, you're right, I mean, I see this with my friends as well, the way in which they talk about Romanians, Gypsies, or Africans, it's absolutely horrible. And I think, I mean, this comes back to the exile question about diaspora, being a son of a migrant. I mean, although I was born here, being a son of a migrant, that will always, I mean, I will always associate my politics with the subaltern, the underdog. And the underdog now happens to be, the Romanians or the travellers, etc. And that's why I locate my politics, because I think there is so much that we can actually learn from that positionality. Because with that positionality, gives so much strength. But also, we have to stand in solidarity with the next flux of migrants that are actually coming. And then they will go through the same historical experiences once again. So, I mean, as a son of a migrant, I can never say, I will never say that, immigration, we need to reduce immigration or stop immigration. I mean, how can I? The luxuries that's being granted to me, am I going to stop the same luxuries to someone else? I mean, I left school without any GCSEs, but yet still I have a PhD and, I teach at a university. I've written, a book, I've got another book coming out. I mean, this is what this space has offered me. I mean, I don't have the audacity to stop the same privileges that's been extended to me, to another group of people. And that's why I find the politics of like Michael Howard and, even the Labour Party now, I don't know if there's any Labour Party people here, this red mug business about, immigrants. It's shocking. It really deeply offends me. Second part of the question about the New Zealand, I don't know enough about that experience, but I'd love to learn about the New Zealand experience.
I think they killed off most of the Maoris.
No, they tried.
Oh, yes.
Can I just ask? So I was going to say, so the difference being is that from almost like from its political creation, the tools of democracy, if you like, they had to negotiate. And I think there's a legacy in the global context. Obviously, the Australian failed experience, in my view, and then coming to New Zealand, you had to come with a slightly different attitude. And when you read through Maori literature, for example, they recognise that and saw that and see that. And when you look at historical documents, those are the things that are noted. I'm not saying they were equal partners there, but what I'm trying to say is there was an understanding that there's going to have to be some form of partnership. It's not we're going to go and rule. So I think that made a difference in New Zealand. When you look at race and how we teach race politics in the UK, I think we often almost never use the New Zealand experience, but we do touch on the Australian experience. Obviously
in the UK experience as well. But I just think there's a bit of a void, and I think it could, make it much richer.